My name is Fareed, and I'm an addict. And it's important that I start here, and I start my story on March 1st, 2018. That's the day I left for substance abuse rehab in South Africa. I remember that day vividly, actually. I can even remember what I packed in my bag. I can remember the sense of fear and anxiety, but also a sense of optimism. I remember saying goodbye to my 5-year-old son and my 4-month-old son, and I remember saying goodbye to my wife and her words that gave me that optimism. She said, "You go and get better, and we'll be right here when you get back." Now, when I got there, it was crazy. They take your phone, they take your laptop, you're there for 28 days, no contact with the outside world. I'd hit rock bottom though. At 43 years old, I'd lost everything. Business was bad, my family wanted me to get better, my close family, blood family didn't speak to me because of my addictions and my issues. I wasn't accountable to anyone. Someone in rehab told me something so important that I've held with me over the last 2 years. When you hit rock bottom and you break yourself all the way down, the best part is you get to build yourself all the way back up again. I'll tell you how that worked out a bit later on. The AA and NA program globally has a 12-step program, and I won't go through all the 12 steps, but I'll focus on the first 4. Step 1 is admitting that you're powerless over alcohol and drugs and that your life has become unmanageable. Step 2 is handing over that powerlessness to a higher power. And step 3 is accepting that you need help. Step 4 is to take a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself. The first 3 steps, simple: admission, acceptance, and you move on. But I got to step 4 when I came out of rehab, and I couldn't do it. I simply could not do that moral inventory. I didn't want to open up that Pandora's box. I didn't want to take a deep look inside myself. And as they say will happen, when you leave rehab, if you don't go to meetings and you don't do the step work, you'll relapse. And that's exactly what happened. After a year of sobriety, and I managed to stay sober for a full year, but staying sober is such a small part of the recovery process because there's so much more you have to do in order to get better, and that's where the step work comes in. So after that relapse, I found myself going back to a very, very dark place again, a place that I could remember were like the days leading up to me going to rehab. Self-loathing, anxiety, insecurity, unable to see or meet people, not being accountable. I was back into that place again. So I decided in December this year to go back and see my addiction counselor. And she asked me if I remember what pre-addiction Fareed looked like. I couldn't really remember, but we took a trip down memory lane at that point. I was an anxious, nervous child. I grew up in a very angry household. My father was an alcoholic, although no one ever admitted it. The emotional and physical abuse that I saw from my father towards my mother had affected me in such a way that I always looked for escapes. Initially, it was easy. As a kid, I found sports, and I was very good at it. I excelled at sports. If I was on the basketball court or the tennis court or in the swimming pool, I could be someone else, somewhere else, and do my own thing. I would come home from school, do my homework, I'd go outside, shoot hoops in the front yard, come back in, have dinner, go back outside until it was time for bed, and that was my daily life. That was my escape. That was through junior high school and high school. I was someone else. I was a hero. I could pretend I was someone else. But when I got to college, the competition for places on sports teams was not possible. The level of competition was so high. I didn't make the teams, so I found another escape, and that was through drugs and alcohol, which was quite normal in those days in university in Florida to experiment with drugs and alcohol. Many people do it through college and then sort of taper off when they graduate. I was not that person, unfortunately, mostly with weed and alcohol in college. I started bartending as well to pay my way through college. I became a very good bartender and even entered flair bar competitions, spinning bottles and things like that. When I graduated college, I moved to a bar in Atlanta, a very high-end bar at the beginning of Buckhead, which is the party quarter of Atlanta, Georgia. The bar's name was the Rock Bottom Brewery, so if that wasn't a sign, I don't know what else could have been. But I was very good. I was in control. I had all the power behind the bar. I was the man behind the bar. Had made a name for myself on the bar scene, in fact, in the southern part of the United States. But that's also where I discovered cocaine. Not to party, not a drug to enjoy, but a drug to cope. So my bar shift used to begin at 6 p.m. and end at 4 a.m. And cocaine helped me to get through those long nights, Thursday, Friday, Saturday nights. I made a ton of money. And I really enjoyed it. One of the most enjoyable jobs I'd had, but also a job that was putting me on a path to self-destruction. The beginning, or the middle of that path, actually, to self-destruction. When I moved to Kenya in 2000, I was thrown into the limelight almost immediately as a radio presenter. And those of you who remember those days and us radio presenters in those days, we never paid for drinks, we were invited to the best parties, we were exposed to the best drugs, etc., etc. And I didn't disappoint. I was actually right at the top of my game, if that's what the game was. But that was also getting to the point of self-destruction. And unfortunately for me, the wheels began to come off around 2016 or 2017 when I stopped being accountable. I stopped working hard. I stopped being able to follow through. I couldn't take myself to places. I couldn't go to meetings. It was depression mixed with substance abuse, and it was all falling apart. I want to cut back now to March 18th, 2018, my 18th day of a 28-day stint in rehab. And it was the day where they call it in recovery, they say it's called letting go and letting God. And for me, my God is a higher power, spiritually. I don't look at it as God, I look at it as a higher power. Letting go and letting God is that moment in your recovery where everything kind of starts to make sense, where you kind of see that there's clarity, and the reason you're doing this is for a greater purpose for yourself and for the people around you. But that was also the day that I walked into my counselor's office in my private counseling session at the rehab center, and she was holding a slip of paper. It was actually an email, and it was an email from my wife. My wife had picked the kids, collected the kids and moved to Switzerland on that very same day. That completely broke me. In the middle of a rehab center, doing something that I thought was going to keep the family together, and getting an email saying that we've gone, we've left. At that point in my rehab stint, I thought to myself, that's it. I want to get out of here. I want to leave. I told them I'm leaving, and you can, of course, it's a voluntary situation. I said, give me my passport, give me my phone, give me my laptop. I'm going to pack my bags, I'm leaving. After hours and hours of chatting with counselors and recovery assistants and the senior counselor at the rehab center, good sense prevailed. And not only did I stay for the 28 days, but I tacked on an extra week of my stay. But when I came back to Nairobi on the 7th of April, 2018, I walked into a 3-story house with 3 cars in the driveway, an empty house, a 3-story house that was empty. I sat on my son's bed and I cried. I wept just on my own in this house, and it was just empty and echoey and weird. And I thought to myself, I mean, what was all this for? What was all the hard work? What was all this really about? I mean, it's all here, the shell of what appeared to be a good life. But to be honest with you, in the height of my addiction, my family actually preferred it when I wasn't in that shell. It was a more complete home when I was away. I cried because I couldn't smell my son's hair and tell him I loved him. I cried because, his clothes were gone from the closet. I cried because I didn't even know my 4-month-old son, really. In fact, it's at that very moment that I realized I'd never held my 4-month-old son sober. I had so much resentment, so much anger, so much animosity towards my now ex-wife, but it was probably the wisest decision she's ever made in hindsight, leaving me because I had put them through 10 years of hell, really, through my active addiction. It's funny how it works out, because if I cut forward now to 2019, December, in Maui, sitting on a surfboard in the ocean, and still on and off using up to that point, I hadn't really become sober, the odd drink here, the odd drink there, trying to convince people around me that I wasn't an addict, that I could control my using. And I sat on this surfboard in Maui, waiting for the waves to come in, and I just started crying again. But these weren't tears of sadness, they were tears of absolute joy. And this clarity came over me. The sky was bluer, the ocean was bluer, it was clearer, the trees were more green. And in recovery, they call it a spiritual awakening. And this is exactly what happened to me on the ocean. I'm not saying I needed to transport myself to Hawaii and the ocean for that to happen. What I'm saying is in every addict's recovery, someone who really wants to get clean, it happens, the spiritual awakening. And I'd waited for 2 years for this to happen, and it finally happened. So I started looking for NA and AA meetings in Maui, and I started going every single day. And when I came back to Nairobi, I'd been clean and sober my entire holiday, and I started the step work again. Acceptance, admission, handing over, and powerlessness. The first 3, really easy. And then I got to step 4. Make a searching and fearless moral inventory of yourself. I pondered on it for a few days, then I took out an A4 pad and I started writing every day after work from 6 p.m. to 7 p.m. Every transgression, every remorseful situation, every awful thing I did to somebody, everything that I felt someone did to me that was awful. I wrote it all down. And after about 2 or 3 weeks, I'd filled this A4 workbook with just hundreds of lines of things that were were bothering me, that I was holding in my shoulders and in the back of my neck, that always made me tense and angry, that forced me to have a chip on my shoulder all the time. And I read them back to myself, and I stood up, and it was to that day. The last thing I wrote was from that very day, and I stood up, and it was gone, completely gone. Step 5 is to share that inventory with your higher power and someone you trust. So I called my sponsor, and we sat down at my dining table, and we went through them. He never passed judgment. He'd stop me and ask me to repeat a few things, maybe ask me how I felt about a few things, but he never passed judgment. We went through them over and over again, and again, that feeling of weightlessness, everything just came off my shoulders, And then he asked me a very poignant question. He said to me, "What are your values?" And I said, I don't know what you mean. He said, "Well, what values did you have growing up?" And, to be perfectly honest, I said to him, I didn't really come from a household with values. I think my growing up was pretty valueless. And he said, "Okay, well, if you could rewrite the book of values, what would they be right now?" So I took a pen and paper and I wrote down a number of items, the ones I can remember: to be honest, to be faithful, not to lie, not to cheat, to be a good husband, to be a good father, to be a good son, to be empathetic, to be accountable. And he said, "Read them back to me." He said, "Stand up and read them back to me." So I stood up and I read these values back to him. And he said to me, "You can now live by this set of values. 45 years old. These were the values I was given that I can live by." And that's the man you see standing here before you today.